Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Syed Ali, and I'm the Senior Director of Strategy and Partnerships here at Trinity Church NYC. We at Trinity are great champions and supporters of GoVoteNYC. And for those of you who don't know, I hope you all do. GoVoteNYC is a collective commitment that philanthropic funders in New York City have made to strengthening democracy through civic engagement. And that work happens through credible messenger nonprofit organizations across New York City who are connected to their communities. So just three quick stats about GOVA NYC's impact. So the first is that we've made more than $3.5 million in grants since 2021. We've attracted more than $13 million in aligned funding, and that in the last year, our organizations have made more than 2.4 million contact attempts in 2024. And I'm sure we're all excited to see what can happen in 2025 with all of the attention that's already come to the mayoral race and others in the city this year. So I think it's really important that we refresh our memories about the concept of ranked choice voting as we head into 2025. I'm sure that's why you're all here. And I think the information that we hear from the illustrious panel today will only help us all grow more sophisticated in our use of ranked choice voting as candidates, as voters, and as civic engagement organizations have to understand better how to wield its power. So thank you to the GoVote NYC grantees, to Neil for coordinating all of this, to Grace and Fiveborough for their work to support today's program, and to our panelists who are joining us. And I'm going to turn it to Katie Honan, who is one of my favorite journalists at one of my favorite outlets, who we all know that past, present, and future candidates for every office are afraid of in the best possible way. So I'll turn it to you, Katie. And you are on mute.
Thank you, Neil, for the introduction in the chat, and Syed for that. Thank you all for joining. I just want to introduce the panelists. We're going to be talking about ranked choice voting 2021, and then obviously what we can look forward to in 2025. So these are our panelists. We have Chris Coffey, the CEO of Tusk Strategies. Emily Paez, the Senior Director of Government and Community Partnerships for the Hispanic Federation. Christina Denio, the Executive Director of FYI. Laura Tamman, a professor of political science at Pace University. And Karen Wharton, Democracy Coalition Coordinator for Citizen Action of New York. So I just want to kick things off going back to 2021. I often say it feels like just yesterday, but also a lifetime ago. That was the first year we used ranked choice voting in New York City elections. So each of you on the panel in your own way was on the front lines of the introduction of ranked choice voting. So what lessons did we learn? Laura, I want to kick off with you first. You studied the voting data closely in 2021. What does it show about how ranked choice voting played out 4 years ago in our mayoral election?
Thank you, Katie. And it's such a joy to be here talking about one of my favorite topics. In 2021, I worked with the Center for Urban Research at CUNY at the Graduate Center to conduct a study of how ranked choice voting played out in 2021. And Steve Romoleski, who most people know is the best maps guy in New York politics, created some really instructive maps that are interactive that I'm just going to put in the chat here if folks want to reference during our discussion. But what we saw, the way we saw ranked choice voting play out was the same way that we have seen ranked choice voting when it plays out in other places, meaning most of the time, the person who would have gotten the most votes in a first past the post system is the same person who wins the election. So that's what happened in 2021. Catherine Garcia did come close to being an RCV sort of upset candidate. And I think the left learned some lessons about ranking and endorsements and that kind of organization. But in terms of the process really played out the way that we would have expected it to.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I'm sure with the second citywide ranked choice voting this year, we may see some changes. I'm going to kick it now to Chris, who I think is still recovering from 2021. He can answer. Now, you have a unique perspective from your work leading Andrew Yang's campaign for mayor. So how did ranked choice voting factor into that campaign strategy? I know you might want to talk about the alliance he formed towards election day or towards primary day with Catherine Garcia.
Yeah, thanks. I just barely got here. I was still in my therapy session from 2021. So I appreciate being here. You know, I think the couple lessons that I think I took away as a campaign manager in 2021 were there were a lot of candidates who actually did not drop out, did not make alliances. So you think of, there were a bunch of, Sean Donovan and Ray McGuire and Scott Stringer who were polling at 2, 3, 4, 1% with a week or two left. And it never made sense to me why you would either not form an alliance or cross endorse. And it became this like, well, you never know. There's ranked choice voting, so you just never know. And I used to I never understood that, because it felt to me like ranked choice voting isn't magic. Like, you still need people to vote for you. And so if you're going to get a lot of 5s and no votes, you're not going to get, you're not going to finish in the top 3. You need a lot of 1s and 2s to get up there, especially 1s. And so we made a decision, Andrew made a decision late in the primary that he was not going to win, and that the only chance he had, A, for relevance, like I want to stay, I want to be in the mix going down the home stretch, and B, because he actually believed that Catherine Garcia would be the best mayor. If he couldn't win, he thought she would be the best mayor. And so we did this quasi cross endorsement. It wasn't actually a cross endorsement, because Catherine didn't actually say she was going to rank him second, but she said he was going to be on her ballot, and he said he was going to urge people to rank her second. And what we saw was a lot of Andrew's voters who in that last 8 days moved over to Garcia for their number 2, especially in the Hasidic community where Andrew, and the Asian communities where Andrew was doing really, really well. We got about 110,000 votes. And before that announcement, a lot of our votes were Eric Adams votes. Our second place votes were Eric Adams votes. And what you saw coming out of that, especially again within the Asian and Hasidic community, was all of a sudden Garcia was getting a lot of 2s, and she really did close that gap and came about 7,000 votes away. Catherine came in 3rd in first place votes, and she was 12% behind Eric Adams in first place votes. And yet she came a hair away, 7,000 votes, 7,500 votes away from winning the whole thing, which I think shows the power of ranked choice for finding a consensus candidate, although you do need those first place votes, because even Catherine came up just short.
Thank you. And I know we will speak later about if you foresee any potential partnerships and cross endorsements, or I guess in the case of Catherine Garcia saying, thanks for the number 2, Andrew Yang, I won't commit to ranking you second. It was funny to watch in person. Karen, Rank the Vote did a lot of training and voter education 4 years ago. Can you talk about the successes you might have had in 2021, and actually also if you plan to do more of that in 2025?
Hi, good morning, and thank you so much. Yes, we did do quite a bit of work in 2021. Outreach. We conducted over 600 online and in-person trainings, collaborated with over 700 organizations. And we, in fact, ended up touching over 1 million New Yorkers. So in terms of outreach, it was successful, and the data shows that. We did do we conducted a poll during early election in 2021, and the results showed that 85% of New Yorkers ranked 2 or more candidates. 95% felt that that they understood ranked choice voting and how to rank. And so we feel like it was a success that New Yorkers generally reported that they understood how to rank. We also trained a number of candidates and campaigns, and some of them were able, particularly around city council races, did find ranked choice voting to be advantageous. Some of them reported that it made them less inclined to go negative. So overall, we feel it was a successful year. In terms of this year, we are focusing on reaching out to communities that where English is like the second language. English is not the first language. So we are working on, as we did last time around, on a number of our materials being translated into multiple languages. We're working on up to 13. We're also going to, just like last time around, use culturally competent people to interact with those communities. Citizen Action also plans to do outreach through phone and text banking. And so there's and the CFB as well has a very comprehensive plan to do outreach.
Thank you so much. And again, for any, if anyone wants to drop in, I know for some people might be curious about how they can volunteer on outreach. If you have any information, I'm actually writing something about volunteering for voter outreach now. So there is I'm self-serving when I ask for any links you could share as well. Christina, FYI supported a big public service announcement campaign to introduce ranked choice voting to the public. What messages did you find were the most effective in informing voters, I guess, both about the election and then about the ranked choice process?
Thank you, Katie. Yes, in 2021, we had a significant large-scale PSA voter education initiative. And during that time, we disseminated 43 PSAs and created them 15 languages. We worked with 12 artists and we partnered with over 18 organizations. As far as messages, there were many, many messages. I'm just going to drop a link here because our work is very visual. So it would be great for you to see a little bit of what we did. So when I think about the messages that resonated, I think about the messages and the methodology. And I would give two examples of the dozens we had. One is the messages and the PSA work we did around older adults. We partnered with Live On and we created PSAs, and those PSAs were disseminated in places that trusted spaces that older adults would frequent, like senior centers. And we also made sure those messages got to them. And one really creative initiative we spearheaded was with City Meals on Wheels, where we had a PSA in 10,000 boxes of meals that were delivered to seniors. And one of those PSAs, the message was more choice, more voice, more power. And that was coupled with an explainer so that we know that senior older adults are a reliable voting base, but we know they're very familiar with the traditional voting methods, and ranked choice voting was something brand new. So in addition to these PSAs and these messages, we made sure to include these explainers so that they could have ranked choice voting really explained and demystified. Another example I'll give you of a message that worked really, really well was for young voters. We commissioned a young spoken word artist by the name of Fanta Ballo. And she put together this beautiful, it's included in the link I dropped, a beautiful poem. And some of the messaging in that was give us more choices, highlight our voices, let the people decide. And that was released on Juneteenth. This is a young spoken word artist based in Harlem, and that was disseminated on social media. And so we think about the messages, but we also think about the methodology and being really creative in reaching particular voters and demographics across the city. So those are two of many, many examples of some of the work that we did in 2021 to educate and reach voters about ranked choice voting.
Thank you so much. And Emily, the Hispanic Federation also did a lot of outreach in 2021. What did you hear from the voters you engaged with back then? And what can you anticipate or are anticipating for this election cycle?
Well, thank you so much for that, Katie. This is great to be in this space and talking about this election with so many folks that have been in this fight for many years. And the Hispanic Federation, to just kind of go back into the year, 2021 was a very interesting year in terms of voter outreach and voter engagement. We're talking about, a year after or shortly after a new normal for some extent, right, in terms of the pandemic. Folks that we were outreaching, doing outreach to traditionally on the ground and engaging with them in person through some of these in-person events. The ways that we were engaging with our voters were all remote, right? These were finding ways to communicate with our voters that one, this election is coming up. What is at stake? What is going to be voted for? And then also factoring in, language and information around what this new system for local elections meant. What did ranked choice voting meant? And some of the things and lessons learned from the 2021 election, as we talk about language and the translation of sometimes these terms, right, that how critically important it is for us to just even understand, voto por orden de preferencia could be very different than voto de orden por clasificación, in terms of like, because we're not classifying candidates, we're ranking them. So preferencia was a preferred kind of terminology and use. But also we found that it was critically important for us to diversify the ways that we engaged with voters during that time to really focus on the issues that mattered to the community and talking about, how we would engage with the community, whether it be through the health space or the education space or tagging into those issue areas that would help align the community with voting. But it was a very kind of, we do know that there was an understanding somewhat of ranked choice voting, but also we had a very low voter participation overall. Out of the registered voters, I think there was roughly 26% of the community came out to vote during that primary election. And that folks, while it was something that we're becoming familiar with, and there was so much great work that was done from so many organizations to really help educate the community around this new system, that there, it's still a new system that folks are learning about and becoming familiar with. And so, making sure that there were small video clips that would make it easily translatable to see how we can create, ranking your top favorite, baseball teams or ranking your top favorite, fill in the blank, right? Things that would resonate with a specific community ultimately helped kind of translate what this new system was and what, how to kind of utilize and benefit from this system. And one of the things that, we find and anticipate now, well, one, we have a fair advantage of like being able to kind of be on the ground and engage with voters, because we're in a very different time, but also understanding the importance of governance and who we have seen in public service. And so utilizing this moment and this opportunity to kind of ramp up and engage with New York City residents on the importance of these different positions and what they mean, and utilizing and maximizing this ability to rank, right? Because you have up to 5 choices, whereas before you had one single option. And so how do you maximize this ability to put up your top 3 favorite, your top 5 favorite, and helping to kind of continue to do that education, to continue to kind of lead into those issue bases and kind of, continue to deepen those dialogues that has been shown to be, very successful.
Thank you so much. And we're now going to focus on 2025, because I think for me as a reporter, the main issues I find, when you moving away from all the candidates and their own issues and how they feel about important topics, it's just the voter turnout that is always anemic, unfortunately, here in New York City, even though it's now easier than ever to vote. But I guess keeping with that ranked choice theme, and I want to ask Chris and Laura to just kick us off with this question on how this year might look different than 2021 when it comes to ranked choice voting.
Well, so I think the left last time, and I don't, I think the candidates that would be considered on the left last time were not organized in a way to help each other. So Maya, for instance, did not try to form an alliance with anybody. We actually talked down the stretch. What Garcia Yang ended up as started as like maybe an anyone but Eric effort, and did not manifest that way, and ended up just being what it was. And the left did not say, hey, here are the 4 candidates that like we, you know, or we're going to do this together. Some unions, you know, and you've seen more of this in 25, but some unions said, here's our preference. And here are 3 people, or here are 2 people. And now we're seeing a lot more of that with political clubs and with unions as well. But I think what we did not have was the sort of moderate candidates aligned, although arguably Yang and Garcia were more moderate. Adams was not part of that. And you did not see the left candidates aligned. And I think in this election, it would very much not surprise me in some way. And again, some of this depends on, like, is Eric Adams going to be on the ballot? Is he not going to be on the ballot? But hypothetically, whether or not he's on the ballot, if Andrew Cuomo and Eric Adams are on the ballot and heading down the stretch, it would not surprise me to see Lander, Zoran, maybe Jessica, maybe Zellner, maybe Scott, say anyone but Andrew Cuomo and Eric Adams. I think it's harder when there's 2 people to be anyone but. So I think it's an easier message to say anyone but Adams, anyone but Cuomo. But I would look for that sort of now the problem is, and I'll stop talking after this, like I think some of those candidates don't like each other. So the idea that that Scott and Brad are going to like form an alliance together would mean they have to talk to each other. And the idea that Brad, who thinks he's trying to run as a centrist, and like Zoran is going to form an alliance with Zoran may complicate his effort to now be a centrist. So we'll see how they, you know, I think this early, you don't see those alliances as much when you still think you don't need the alliances. But as you get down the stretch and there's a month left and polling still shows you at 8 or 10 or 12 and someone else at 25 or 30, you have to come up with something to stay relevant and to try to get those number 2 and number 3 votes somehow. And so I would expect more cross endorsement. I'll be your 2, you be my 1, whatever, however that manifests.
And I would say that I agree completely with Chris's advice to candidates. I'm not sure I share his optimism that they will actually do that, because it's just really hard to get, like you pointed out, folks to talk to each other who don't feel like they have a lot to talk about, and aren't interested in talking with one another. But where I think things will be different in 2025 is with the endorsers. And we know that the endorsers are really critical in an election like this. The people who show up to vote in an off-year municipal primary election tend to be pretty plugged in voters. So they're looking to local organizations or the unions or their local elected officials to tell them what to do in terms of who to support for mayor. And especially in this volatile time when there's so much going on at different levels of government, there's a lot of concern and angst and just sort of sense of chaos. I think those trusted endorsers are going to be even more important than ever. So I think that the endorsers learned their lesson in 2021 about the importance of ranking. And like Chris said, this dream campaign is really telling. It's narrowing the field early without picking a favorite, which I think they learned was a mistake. They're sort of waiting to see who takes off so they can rank more effectively, and feel more confident that their rankings, that their chosen candidates will still be viable at the end. So that's how I see this playing out in 2025. I see organizations endorsing later than they did. I see them doing more rankings than they did. Those are the things that I think will be different.
And I'll just add one follow-up question, and anyone can kind of, any of the panelists can ask. My question with the DREAM Act, and for people who, it's not the DREAM Act, I'm sorry, the DREAM Push. The DREAM Act is something completely different.
The DREAM Campaign,
The DREAM Campaign. Which if people are not familiar, it's actually 2 organizations. First, it was Don't Rank Eric Adams mayor, but then when Andrew Cuomo officially jumped in, it worked out pretty well. They added Andrew to that. And it is, I think what you say about they're not picking their candidate yet. They're just narrowing it. I'm curious if anyone thinks it could backfire, maybe isn't the right word, but especially for a candidate like Eric Adams, who, as you note, Chris, we haven't seen much evidence of his campaign. He's told us it's going to start between soon and very soon.
Yeah, mine too.
But yeah, a lot of stuff is. I'm curious if he could then seize upon that and get his supporters to sort of say, yes, I am the victim here. I am getting attacked. And it could maybe, maybe some people might not like that. You're telling voters to not vote for two people. I don't know if quickly you just have any insight onto whether that could backfire, or maybe it wouldn't make a difference to any of the Adams supporters or Cuomo supporters.
I'm not sure. I think what it will do is I think there'll be an effort on the other side to say like no socialists allowed, or whatever the, don't rank Brad and Zoran, or whatever. I think that it encourages moderate groups to do the same thing. I think if you consider yourself a very progressive voter and someone says don't rank Eric or Andrew, they're pushing an open door in some ways. And I think the same is true on the other side. If a moderate group comes out and says don't rank a socialist candidate or Brad, I think they're pushing an open door, but you do need to do that voter education. The other thing I think is interesting about this is like, so two things. One, in previous elections before 21, folks fought hard for an endorsement, and when they didn't get it, had like sometimes a scorched earth thing, right? They're like, now you can't be scorched earth because you need that number 2 endorsement. There were, even in 21, people forget. I mean, Hakeem ranked Maya and then ranked Eric. Richie Torres ranked Andrew Yang and then Eric Adams. Like, you had a bunch of folks who, by the way, the Hasidic voters, right? There was a long, hard fight for those Hasidic voters between Eric and Andrew. And when Eric lost, he wanted to like be angry and you weren't with me, but he needed them to rank him second. So it just changes the landscape. And I think some of that will happen with the Dream stuff too. Like, you're going to have folks who, I suspect you'll have folks who say, well, I don't want Andrew as my number 1, but like, you'll have some of those folks who will put him 3 or 4 or 2. And the same could be true of Eric Adams if he's actually on the ballot, which I think we still need to wait and see.
Yeah, and I would just say that I don't think it's hard for me to see the Dream campaign backfiring on Eric Adams. But I think there is a scenario in which people say Andrew Cuomo is not Eric Adams. It isn't like these two are not the same. I think that you could get backlash from moderates who like Andrew Cuomo and don't put his behavior in the same category as Eric Adams. I think it's debatable, but I think that is a potential backlash that could happen.
I'm going to jump in as well, Katie. I also think that it might be a little bit of a mistake, the Dream campaign, because it's elevating both Eric and Andrew in the minds of New Yorkers. We're not hearing the names of the other candidates. And so we need to hear more about Brad. We need to hear Zoran's name being mentioned a little bit more. And I'm concerned that the Dream campaign is like taking up a lot of the oxygen in the room at the moment around Andrew and Eric. And New Yorkers are saying, we don't know who these other candidates are. We don't even know who is running. So we need to have a campaign that highlights some of the other candidates as well.
Thank you. And I do have a follow-up now I'm going off the script just briefly and asking the people on the panel. It's something that I think about as a reporter and my colleagues talk about. Everyone has been going after Andrew Cuomo because he's leading the polls, has high name recognition. But a lot of people say voters, and especially people who've done a lot of outreach, they want to vote at the end of the day. They want to vote for someone, not necessarily against someone. So whoever wants to chime in here on the panel, do you hear that or some version of that from people when you do outreach? I know in 2021, when Andrew Yang was leading the polls, people were attacking him. I just don't know how much negative campaigning actually, it might work to get you a brief story in a newspaper or a little 30-second blip on the news, but I don't know what's actually resonating with voters. And I guess that also ties into the Dream campaign, right? They keep hearing, now people might only know that Eric Adams and Andrew Cuomo are running for mayor and they don't know anyone else.
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
as I think, I can't remember who mentioned earlier that voter turnout was low in 21. Voter turnout in New York is really low, terrible compared to the rest of the nation. And when I do outreach and I talk to voters, one of the things they complain about is the quality of the candidates. And so a concern is that folks are going to say none of the above. I'm just sick and tired of all, of these candidates. When am I going to get a candidate that I can vote for? Something is wrong with Andrew. Something is wrong with Eric. Something is wrong with Scott. I'm not showing up. And so I think we need to consider that when we have these campaigns, and also when we select our candidates, that voters are really yearning for something different.
I think you're seeing some of that with Zohran right now. Zohran Madami has 7 times more donors, or at least the last time I checked, than the next person. He has a whole lot of volunteers. He's campaigning in a different way, and it's working with his folks. Now it's a very it's a social, he bills himself as a socialist, so it's a very left voter that's into it, but he's pulling more folks into the process, I think. And I think that, you look for some signs that someone has really caught fire or not, or whether it's just sort of within a bubble. And certainly like those macro signs, how many donors, how many volunteers do you have, how many signatures do you have for getting on the ballot? Those point to someone who at least has put himself in the top 2 or 3. The polling still shows him quite far behind. One issue that I think that doesn't get talked enough about ranked choice voting, and it's not meant as a criticism of ranked choice voting, but if you think back to I don't know, 2001, if you can go back that far, or you had these battles with some really big people, and I don't know that voters are paying attention. Right? Like, I just don't know how much in the summer of 2001, going down the stretch, like Alan Hevesy versus Mark Green versus Freddie Ferrer versus Peter Vallone. And so the runoff, like you just get, all of a sudden it's primary day. Like, I don't know if I've got to vote for 5 people. Like, I can't vote for 5. I can barely vote for 1 person. And then at least with the runoff, you then had 2 weeks to look at these candidates and say, okay, it's Mark Green or Freddie Ferrer. It's Ed Koch versus Mario Cuomo. It's, Al Sharpton versus Ruth Messenger. Like, whatever the dynamic is. Now, the downside of that is it led to the non-person of color tending to leapfrog over the person of color. And so that's a problem. On the flip side, Eric Adams has said lots of times that he thinks ranked choice has all sorts of racial issues for him too. And you look at someone like Garcia, who is at 19%, and again almost beat Eric Adams at 31%. I do think that runoff forced people to focus on, here are my 2 options. And again, I'm not touching on you can't do this without doing the racial part of this. I strongly suspect if Catherine Garcia and Eric Adams had been in a runoff, Garcia would have won.
I'd also just like to jump in as a ranked choice voting enthusiast and note that you also have a participation challenge with the runoffs, that the people who then show up to vote for the runoff, it's inevitably participation goes down. So it's not the same electorate picking the mayor, which some people see as, like myself, as kind of problematic. But it also, by changing the composition of the electorate, you do change who ends up winning it.
Problematic.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yep.
I guess this is my question just broadly for all the panelists, and obviously dealing with voter turnout, and then explaining, like you said, maybe they don't even like 5 candidates. How do you think, or I guess, how do you message across to the voters that they should view their ballots a little differently? Do you encourage them to always rank 5? I know some people have expressed why you should rank 5. Some people say it doesn't matter. If anyone, especially an expert, in voter outreach, if that question kind of came across with how people should view their ballot and how they should even vet their candidates.
I think that goes to demystifying how ranked choice voting works. I think there's some myths that you must rank 5 and you have to, you'll be in a position where you're going to be forced to vote for people you don't like, and that's not the case at all. So I think this goes to the heart of voter education about ranked choice voting. But the heart of it is all your votes matter, but you are not required to vote for all 5. You can vote for the folks that that you support. So I think really making sure that's part of voter education in 25 leading up to the primary is really essential.
Yeah, and I think it depends on the role that you're playing, right? For the candidates, like Chris said, they have to focus on being the voters' first choice. And maybe a few of them end up ranking, but that's really their lane. It's the organizations and the endorsers' role to clarify how they should be ranked. And ranked choice voting, it's a difficult thing to explain to people, but it's actually very easy to do. I've done tons of ranked choice voting simulations, and I've never had my students walk out saying, "What did I vote for? I don't understand what I did."
Yeah, I always say as a voter, you just rank your 5. I guess what happens I guess I never really knew what happened on my ballot anyway. So you just put it in the slot and the rest is kind of up to the Board of Elections.
Well, I think it allows you to do your heart and your head. So if you have some people say, I love this person, I don't think they have a chance, but like I love them, you can put that person 1 and know that you voted for that person. They may or may not have a chance. And then I think you can also fall back and say, but I would rather X versus Y. So I'm going to put X as my number 2 or my number 3, and I'm not going to rank Y. And I think, by the way, you saw some of that in 21 too, where it was like, I'd rather Eric Adams than Andrew Yang, so I guess I'll put Eric Adams number 5 on my ballot, and I'm not going to put Andrew Yang, or occasionally, but rarely the other way.
Just really quickly, I wanted to jump here in terms of voter education and understanding of this system. And I think that sometimes when we speak in spaces where this becomes more familiar, more top of mind, we're kind of in, kind of this kind of community of civics, right? When we're talking to everyday voters, this is not very translatable and it's not very easily to understand. And so when we talk about this election cycle, and this being a new method of voting for municipal elections, again, I continue to revisit the need and the priority of understanding why those ranks matter and how they can see those things illustrated, right? So if we're, by example of that, if we're on a, an in-person kind of like approach, we're asking everyone to rank them and they see that everyone who ranked and the reasons why they ranked, this is the tabulation if they kind of get 5 candidates. And if everyone in this room has to rank up to 5 candidates, this is the result. And then what would the result be if only, folks only ranked up to 3 candidates, and what would that look like? And so I think that, understanding the power of the ranking still needs to be translated into understanding what that ranking and how to utilize and kind of go through those tabulations. Because, when we start thinking about like the strategies and the tactics and things and the cross endorsements, I think those all are really important. But for some folks, the 50 plus 1% is still something that is a knowledge gap. And there are knowledge gaps in terms of this level of understanding that, when we talk about, I think Karen alluded to it earlier, right? New York different elections happening, and then we're factoring in a new method of voting for these very kind of fine election cycles and under this level of government. Again, I think it's just a matter of revamping and doing the educational piece and working alongside local community organizations and having the funding to be able to do so, right? And not just to do it like in these heightened periods when the work is happening, but how do you establish those long-term relationships with community and having them understand what these nuances are. I think we had the great pleasure, Hispanic Federation alongside other CBOs, to create digital assets in 2021 with FYI to talk about how to engage and things of that nature. So I continue to reiterate the importance of education when it comes down to ranked choice voting, because the everyday voter is likely to maximize on this ability to, rank up their candidates once they have a little bit more knowledge and understanding. Because again, there was a very small percentage of folks that came out to vote in 2021. And I think that there were a lot of lessons learned. But, even when we talk about just the mayoral race, if we separate that from 2021, I think that a little less than 50% of folks in just like the mayor actually ranked up to 5 people just for mayor in 2021. And roughly 13% only ranked one candidate because they probably weren't as fully familiar with the system. And so again, I just kind of lean into that, language matters, the fact that education continues to be a very important piece for everyday voter, everyday person in New York City to understand this and really maximize ranked choice voting.
That's actually a good opportunity for a follow-up, especially in 2021. What were some of the biggest misconceptions you heard about ranked choice voting that you sort of had to debunk?
I can take that. I think there's a lot of misconceptions then and now. I think one is that ranked choice voting is unproven and it's scary. And so all of our voter education goes to the heart of this. But as we know, it's been used for decades in the US. I think it started in 1940 in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and it's now in 62 jurisdictions in the US as of 2022. So just really debunking that it's unproven and scary, that it's not just in New York, it's been used for decades, it's proven, and that's something important to keep in mind and continue to debunk. So that's one misconception that we hear.
Did anyone else here kind of, I had to explain it to a lot of my friends and family if I could actually get them, especially a lot of friends forget that there's an election. And anyone else want to bring up anything that they had heard about ranked choice voting?
I'll bring up another one that I think I mentioned it or touched on it earlier, is that that you must rank 5. So it's important that we continue to educate the public, the voting population, that you have that option. It is absolutely not a requirement, but it is an option and you're empowered to, but you're not required to. And then also, as you just mentioned, Kate, like it's another misconception is that it's complicated, but I know that surveys have shown that voters really, once they're doing it, they have no trouble using it, and that where ranked choice voting is used, voters want to keep using it. So those are just a couple more.
Yeah, and the main misconception that I have encountered is people who think that they can't do what Chris said, which is just vote your heart and know that your vote will count. People think, oh, wait, so what does this mean I should do differently this time to make sure that we block? And like, that's the biggest misconception, is that it's just some sort of tactical way of voting that that's unfamiliar and that they need to learn. So it's actually the misconception of it is that it is some complex, difficult to process thing when it's actually quite simple and straightforward.
I definitely agree that there's a lot of misconception around just conceptualizing this process and feeling like there's like, well, there's this new system and they're now going to create something that's going to be a result because that's the outcome that they want to see, as opposed to understanding the nuances within. And then, like you said, Katie, sometimes it is oftentimes like I would also like get calls like, hey, can you explain this system to me? I'm still trying to understand. And so there is a lot of kind of misconception, but there's also, in those misconceptions, I think there's room for opportunity. Because there's the ability for us to say, well, this is how, and this is why this is not what you are kind of leading with or understanding it to be. So.
And I am curious, this was brought up a little bit earlier, but especially when you're out interacting with voters, do you find that they're having conversations? It used to be, you have one favorite baseball team, one kind of favorite team, but then obviously you have all these caveats. If so-and-so is not in the playoffs and I root for this person because I hate the whatever. Do you find voters lay out their full ballot for you and in conversations? And how do you actually generate conversations around not just, I know you're really into Zoran Mamdani, but who else would you put as 2, 3, 4, and 5?
So I find that it's beginning to change. that people are approaching me and talking about, well, maybe not what's the top 5, but who should I put as my top 3? Or, here is how I'm going to rank. So I think it is voters are beginning to lean a little bit more into it. Maybe, as I said before, maybe not all 5, because some are saying, oh, that's just too many. But I can certainly do 3. I'm going to stick with 3. So I think, like I said, it's beginning to change.
And anyone else want to add anything before we move on? Perfect. And this also was brought up briefly earlier, but can we expect more? And we saw a little bit in 2021. We've seen a little bit of it so far with endorsements from political clubs and unions. But can we expect even more of that, where we will no longer just get one big endorsement, but we'll actually get a full slate? Obviously, I mean, a lot of the unions have just so far been endorsing Andrew Cuomo for mayor, but I don't know if others might also give later on a second, third, and fourth and fifth.
So,
so I think, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Chris.
I think there'll be pressure from the candidates, to the extent they have any control, to come out early for one. And then I think what you saw in 21, at least, and I mentioned Hakeem, I mentioned Richie, like they came out relatively, I mean, I don't remember, Richie was was January for Andrew Yang. And then I think by May, he ranked to number 2 with Eric. Hakeem was like April for Maya, and then June, I think, for Eric. I think there'll be pressure from the candidates to not put out a slate, but to do like, I'm your one. And then I think you'll see later, some folks will then say, okay, but here's a number 2 and here's a number 3. And then you'll have folks, I mean, last year, the police union preferred Garcia, Yang, Eric. And I think the fire union did Yang, but then also said, but if you have a number 2, it should be Eric. So I think there'll be some of that. I also think the really the like insidery folks, unions, religious leaders, like they're all over this, right? Because they're like trying to game out, well, I have to stay with Eric if he's running, but I'll give Cuomo will be my number 2, and we'll tell people, and we're going to put it on all our ballots, and we'll put it on our mail, and vote 1, vote 2. And I think more and more there were people that did that in 21, but it was still new, and it was like, and I think that the end result of this, whether it's 25 or 29 or 33, I think every 4 years you'll see more and more of it, because otherwise it's like a wasted, right? You don't. By the way, like, so the UFT last time stuck with Scott Stringer when he was polling at 3% or 4% after his sort of scandal. And if I had been UFT, I would have said, okay, like we should have a number 2 because Scott's not going to win, and we need to tell our people, like, if it's between X and Y, who's better for us, Maya or Eric, Garcia or Eric, whatever the calculation is. And so I assume you'll see a lot more of that, but the candidates will push back a little bit because they don't want to like split their love between X and Y. By the way, I think the newspapers that still do this, I mean, the Times unfortunately doesn't do this anymore, and that's too bad. But I assume that like the Daily News last time said, okay, we're with Garcia, but Eric is our number 2.
I believe the Times said now they might maybe endorse after all that. And I'm, again, kicking it back to 2021, every election is different for a number of factors, but that was obviously the first with ranked choice voting, but also we were still in the context of the pandemic. Obviously, COVID is still around in many forms, but that was coming out of the deadliest year. And it really was a big part of the election and the campaigning, and particularly the outreach. So these questions are specifically for Emily, Christina, and Karen. What are the opportunities now without a lockdown and restrictions for outreach, and how do you see things playing out a little differently, or maybe just more in-person rallies, or what we didn't see as much of in 2021?
Sure. I mean, I'd love to jump in on that, Katie. One thing that we have seen recently in these in between years, the importance of just being on the ground and talking to folks, being on Photo Road Plaza, being out in Brooklyn, being out in Neighbors and Queens. and just talking to folks and the impact that that has, and the ability that we're able to just kind of get those like deepen relations, like that kind of relational organizing. So when we look into kind of now entering 2025, maximizing on that ability to be out in local communities, but also not shortchanging, right? 2021 did teach us that we are able to, branch out and reach out to multiple people, like, on a virtual platform, a virtual space, and we can diversify our audiences that way also. But I think that paired with and married with the idea of being on the ground and in local communities, speaking to local organizations that are trusted organizations that can provide this and amplify these conversations around participation, where we may not be there on a day-to-day basis, but they can highlight the importance of participation, the importance of ranked choice voting, the importance of these local elections in their individual spaces, whether we're talking to Voces Latina in Queens or La Colmena in Staten Island, that in their work that they're doing locally, they're able to continue to amplify the importance of participation and these nuanced things, and understanding what ranked choice voting is, and then going through the prompts, right? What is ranked choice voting? But also, what is at stake 2025? What are we looking in terms of what are the roles of these candidates, and what roles do they play, and how does that impact our day-to-day and our quality of life? Because it all comes down to, talking to voters and the registered voting population in a way that they're able to understand what the impacts are going to be to programs that are impacting them on a daily basis.
I'll also chime in as far as looking back at 2021 and what's different in 25. I know we had to get very creative in 21 to get these PSA messages out, whether it was on the digital front or the example I gave earlier about getting those PSAs in boxes that were literally delivered to older New Yorkers. And we did many different creative things. But we also disseminate PSAs on our PSA network, which is a unique thing to FYI. They are screens in trusted spaces across the city of New York. And because in 21, because of the pandemic, foot traffic was lower in these spaces. They were community centers, health centers, et cetera. And so we know now in 25 that these PSAs will be seen by more folks in these trusted spaces. So we know that will be different, but we will still continue to do these innovative things as far as to get the messages out. And I think you always have to take a multi-prong approach. So we had PSAs in the public square, whether they were billboards or taxi toppers or PSAs on bus shelters. Really important to have those PSAs that are targeting specific communities, like in their neighborhoods. But also we're mindful that there's more grassroots opportunities in 25. People are out more, and there's different considerations in 21. So we're adjusting our strategies accordingly. But I think overall, there's more grassroots opportunities to reach different communities, which is wonderful.
I've always wondered that the change in the primary date does not help here. Like, and I don't know that. I don't have data that says that. Jerry Skurnick is on. He might have data, but I've always wondered, I just remember campaigning with candidates like in August and July, where everyone is out and there's block parties and street fairs, and it provides a lot of opportunity to bring the candidates to these places where everybody's outside, and you're outside for the summer, and you're going to the Staten Island Fair and the Bay Ridge this and the, whatever. And now it's June. And at least we saw this last time. It was cold. I mean, we were filming TV ads in Coney Island in April, and there were big jackets on in April, and there just weren't people at Coney Island. So obviously by primary day in mid-June, late June, things are warmer, but kids are still in school. They're less likely to be. And I've always thought that that's a tough, sort of a tougher way to get direct stuff out there. But I guess we'll see.
Yeah, and I think, given where we are in this moment in time, we have the best of both worlds. We now know how to conduct outreach virtually, and we've always known how to do it in person. So I think we have an opportunity to do both. And given sufficient funding, there's an opportunity to actually canvas around ranked choice. to go into neighborhoods where there's limited English proficiency and knock on doors and speak one-on-one with New Yorkers, engage. Candidates can do that too. So I think it's going to be interesting at the end of this period to see how we take advantage of these two types of outreach.
Thank you. And I will ask Jerry if he can unmute himself if he wants to. I am curious about that too, because like Chris said, there's the Third Avenue Feast, the Fourth Avenue Feast, all the Saint Feasts, just being the parades. You kind of miss the entire summer of the parade season. Then I think obviously, that's where candidates had previously really shown their stuff. And we had video of Anthony Weiner dancing at the West Indian Day Parade because of that. But I don't know if you want to chime in, Jerry.
Well, there's really nothing but anecdotal evidence on it. When they switched from the June to the September primary, and whenever there was an election with lousy turnout, people claimed, oh, that's because they switched from June to September. Now that we switched from September to June, the people who are opposed to them switching to June will pick and choose primaries with a lower turnout and say the same thing. We really haven't had the June primary, I think, long enough, the new June primary, since the Democrats took over the legislature and changed it to one June primary as opposed to June and September. I don't think we've had enough elections to, I mean, last 4 years ago was the first June citywide primary, right? Since 1973. So we really don't know yet. I mean, anecdotally, you can make the case both ways, more people, and especially now that it's a lot easier to vote by mail, that could distort the whole thing. It used to be, oh, you have a June primary, people are in the country, they're away, but you can vote now when you're in the country in a way. So we don't know, basically. I mean, I don't know it certainly.
Yeah, like Jerry, I'd say the same thing, that I remember when people would complain, oh, nobody can follow this race because it's summer and people are away and they're on vacation, and then we come back and it's Labor Day and then we vote. Like, that's crazy. No one can focus. So you could kind of make the argument either way. I think the big scheduling move that would increase turnout is to have even year municipal elections.
Yep.
I mean, that's really at the heart of the lack of voter turnout, is that we have off years.
Literally in a campaign, the day after Labor Day, you can feel like the election began. Like, I mean, literally, I lived near the 72nd Street and Broadway subway, and the day after Labor Day, when we had the September primary, there were like 5 candidates there at the subway at 8 in the morning, and there was nobody there the week before.
I just wonder, I don't think Ed Koch wins in June. Like, no blackout, no,
Well,
and I don't know, Mike Bloomberg without 9/11. Like, I don't know. Maybe I think it really would have changed the last 4 years.
but that couldn't work the other way too. Like something happens in May, and if it was a September primary, the May big event won't be important anymore. So, I mean,
we just haven't had those May big events.
The
blackout in August and
the one thing I think that everyone should agree on, that having in even years one primary in June and one in September was stupid. Having one or the other, I could see an argument for both, but the argument against the September primary has to do with military mail-in ballots. So it's a federal law.
I do want to point.
Maybe Elon Musk can decide it's a waste of money and say you don't have to do it anymore. But
well, I don't want to go doge down that hypothetical, but I do want to point everyone's attention to the chat. Grace had put in a survey that the 5 Borough Institute released, with sort of getting the pulse of what voters are most concerned about. Affordability is a top concern, I should say. Mental health crisis in the city, public safety, and New Yorkers want leadership that listens. Especially a lot of support with small local organizations. And for the panel, I am curious, I guess it's up to the candidates to message and to listen to the concerns of voters, but in an outreach perspective, do you do a lot of listening to what people are concerned about and then try to shape that about, you should vote because this is why it's important to vote for mayor. They can they pick who's on the rent guidelines board who could maybe ensure that your rent remains what it is, that kind of thing. I don't know how much work goes into that and figuring out what actually are the largest concerns for voters that could actually drive them to the polls.
Yeah, great question, Katie. I think part of the reason why there is such low turnout is people are having difficulty connecting elections with their everyday issues. So when we engage them, however we engage them in the streets and churches, whatnot, it's important to connect voting with whatever their problems are. So they can't afford rent. And so they're like, well, why should I show up? I'm not going to vote whenever because I have problems. I can't even pay my rent. Why will I vote? And so in that instance, you're like, well, maybe you should look at the candidates and see which one is speaking to your issue. And then maybe if you select candidates that are addressing your issue, affordability issues or whatever they are, then maybe you can begin to solve your problem. We also have to explain to New Yorkers that civic engagement is not just on election day. We need to have an ongoing dialogue with our elected. So it starts on election day or maybe in the run up to during ranked choice voting when we have to rank them, but it needs to continue beyond election day. We need to hold our electeds accountable. And when we're engaging New Yorkers, that's the kind of conversation we find that works, right? And would get them to want to show up because now they understand the process and they see themselves, they're better able to see how they can affect change.
Really quickly to build off of that, I wanted to just share that, when we're doing outreach and we're trying to, ensure that our voters are just making informed decision as a voter, maximizing on some of the resources that are out there, but essentially, we want to bring them into the process. And so if there's any opportunities of engagements where they can go to their local centers and see the candidates for themselves, see and ask them questions, if they can do their due diligence and now, maximizing on some of the resources that are out, right? NYC Votes has a voter guide. How can they kind of maximize, that resource that's available, that's on a nonpartisan level? They're not, promoting here, vote for me or here, rank me this way. It's just, these are the candidates. These are who they are. These are the platform essentially that they are advocating for. And then when there are opportunities to be in the community in, these spaces, whether it's a virtual forum or a in-person forum, and ensuring that the community is aware that those conversations are happening so that independent upon what issues are a priority to you as a voter, that that you can have those conversations directly with the candidates who are running for those positions. And so I think that right now we're really trying to help maximize on those connections and that engagement that is ultimately always happening, in different spaces. But we, as we're looking to this year, have traditionally now started this, Latino Week of Action, but to mobilize our communities. But essentially, we're talking to anyone who stops at our table, independent upon, who they are. We're talking to them and we're engaging with them in community. And so I think it's important to also have that, level of in-person connection to make those intersections and to say, hey, this is what's happening locally in your community and you should be aware. So.
I'm not on the panel, but I'm going to just, I can't sit here and not talk. Katie, thank you. I did ask for her permission before jumping in.
You didn't need it. You could have jumped in anyway, Grace.
Thank you. But I'm Grace Rao. I'm the executive director of the Five Borough Institute, and we're co-hosting this with GoVoteNYC. We're really thrilled to be here. And have put this together, but I just, Karen, I loved what you said, and Emily, sort of on the heels of Katie directing you all to the People's Pulse. I put the link to our survey in the chat that people can take a look at. But this is a really comprehensive citywide issue survey that 5 Borough undertook with the support of several foundation partners. And the survey really seeks to do exactly what Karen said, elevate the voices and concerns of New Yorkers and ensure that the issues that are top of mind for them are really front and center in our political discourse, in the hope that when New Yorkers see the issues that they care about being talked about by candidates running for office, they say, oh, they get it, they understand what I'm thinking, feeling, what I need, and then that encourages them to go out to vote. I just want to highlight a couple of the key findings related to sort of the health of our democracy, voter engagement, all of that for this group, because all of you obviously are on the front lines of doing such important work to boost voter turnout. The survey found that only 50% of New Yorkers that were surveyed believe that their vote makes a difference in elections. Curious if you think that 50% is good news. Is that is the glass half full or half empty for some of the panelists? Just 38% of New Yorkers told us that they believe the democratic process in the city works and improves life for them and their families. And then we asked people what would make them more likely to participate in local elections. The most frequent response that we got was more information about candidates and ballot measures. 40% said that. 32% said they really need to feel a sense of greater trust in the election process. 17% cited easier voter registration, and 15% talked about the need for more accessible polling location information. So having trouble figuring out where their polling spot is located. But I think that information piece, I believe it was Emily just talked about the voter guide, all of those things are so important just in terms of educating the electorate. So I'll pause there, but thank you for letting me jump in, Katie.
I kind of feel like people have to like suck it up a little bit. Like there are people in other countries that haven't gotten to vote that like stand in line for 7 hours with like some purple paint on your finger to vote. And the idea that like we need to do more and more and more and more to get people to have this like, right that everyone, we are all so privileged to have. At some point, it's like, it's on you. Like, yeah, I mean, there are people who can't vote because of, it's hard to get away from my shift. So now you can vote for 10 days, right? Now you can vote in the mail. Now there's more sites that are available. Now there's ranked choice. And at some point, like, it's great that everyone on here does all this education. And I think I'm sure it really makes a difference, but it's like people have to take some responsibility. If you want to complain about the system and you want to like, complain about the mayor. It's amazing how many people like I talk to are like Eric Adams. I'm like, oh, who'd you vote for? I don't vote. And it's like, okay, well then, like I don't know what to tell you. Like you don't. It's hard to have a say if you didn't take part in the process. And I mean, it's hard to be too rough about it, but I just think like there are people in countries that are waiting in line for days to get to vote and are doing it because it is such a privilege and a right and all those things. And I think we take it for granted, and that's how we get 26%, which by the way, 26% isn't even that bad for a city primary.
So Chris, I feel like I have to push back just a itty bitty on you, right? So there's a segment of the population that has been voting for the last 50, 60 years. And have not seen progress commensurate with their voting record. So it's not as though they haven't been showing up. They have been.
So who is that?
The Black population I'm talking about specifically. Right. So we've been voting for years and years and years, and we're still at the bottom of almost all indices. So what do you say to that group? It's not as if they haven't been showing up. It's not, you know, I mean, yeah, we've made voting easier, and people have been taking advantage of early voting, vote by mail. But fundamentally, I think the issue that we're having in New York, and I would assume United States, is people are not seeing the progress that they expect. And so if you've been voting religiously for the last 30 years, and you're still not able to put food on the table, and you've been told, if you vote, life will be easier. At what point do you just throw in the towel and say, it just doesn't make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really fair question. So I have three things. The Democratic primary does not, and all, you know, most New Yorkers are Democrats. And so the Democratic primary does not, there are very few people who can possibly make it out of the Democratic primary. And it's not even about Democrats. It's not like, oh, well, only Democrats versus Republicans. Like, it's not, there are very few Democrats who can make it out of the Democratic primary. The way that the primary is set up, it very much favors hacks. It favors people that have been going to Democratic clubs and trading favors for 30 years. We had all the data on Eric Adams, all the data. Like, it's not like, you know, Eric Adams has surprised. Oh, really? Like, it turns out, like, there were press stories that he lived in New Jersey and that he like had all of these issues, and people voted for him anyway. So I think the primary itself is set up, and I think, you know, should you need a bazillionaire to get around that, like Mike Bloomberg, who just said, you know what, I just won't do the Democratic primary, I'm spend $100 million. That doesn't seem like that's the right answer. But on the flip side, like, the only way to get around the sort of, I'm gonna, like, an entrenched hack who's never really run anything, whether it's a borough president, whether it's a public advocate, whether it's like, they haven't run anything, they're not qualified to, and it's not, I don't mean this like, but if you are going to all of a sudden be the chief executive, 350,000 person employee, and be the crisis manager in a city in need, it helps if you have actual experience in doing some of those things. And if you think the job is just like going from ribbon cutting to ribbon cutting, and then going out to zero bond every night, well, like, it turns out the job is more than that. And I said three things. I actually have two things. I actually think at some point in life, folks will be able to vote on their phone. And I don't know if it's 50 years from now, if it's 5 years from now, if it's 100 years from now, I just don't know. Folks can bank on their phone. They can, like, there are super secure things that you can do on your phone, and it has not unraveled the world. And when you think about how laws have gotten changed here in this country or this city, where we actually galvanize people, the city council was going to stop Ubers, the city council was going to stop yada, yada, yada. And all of a sudden people are like, no, I want to be able to take Uber. I want it. In the old days, they just would have shut it down, because the only people that are showing up to participate are the 100 usual suspects and the entrenched groups that are giving the money to the things. When you expand those folks, and you have more folks who are showing up and saying, wait a minute, I don't know who my city councilman is, but now Uber's telling me that it's this person, and I want to be able, and I'm going to go tell that person. That's how you expand and get new people in. And I honestly think if you could vote on your phone, you would have 26% would turn into 75%. Guess what? Like, the entrenched electeds, they don't want that. They don't want 75%. They want 26%. Because that guarantees their job survival. If you had 75%, half of these people would need real jobs. I didn't really answer your question, Karen, but I did my best.
Just want to jump in and affirm what Karen is saying, and say that a lot of the poll results that Grace mentioned are in line with national trends. So they're not necessarily unique to New York City or New York City's elections. But part of the challenge of the eroding trust in government and people feeling like they have a lack of information is an issue we haven't yet touched on, but I know a lot of people in this Zoom room are concerned about, and that is local news, that the decline in the number of local news outlets and coverage of races that we saw start in really 2001 and steadily declined. And now we've seen a recent uptick with great organizations like the city evolving. But voters are really lacking information about candidates that come from trusted, credible sources.
Thank you. And I know Neil posted in the chat. We're gonna move to Q&A. We could talk for a lot. I could talk for hours about, where people are supposed to are getting their information, and not just a decline in local news, but in decline in where people are getting their news. But if anyone has any questions, please put it in the chat about, for our panelists about voting or ranked choice voting or hacks running our city or
While we're waiting for questions, Katie, I would love to hear your response to
Oh, no.
Laura's point, if you're open to it.
about the sort of lack of information
Or
and
just the idea of sort of the health of local news in New York City right now and what's happening. There are many bright spots with the growth of nonprofit news outlets like the City, and yet it's much more fractured than it was historically. So it does feel like the public, we're not in an era where there's like, 2 or 3 major New York City newspapers that everybody gets their news from in the same way that it used to be.
yeah, and I do think it's twofold, right? It is the decline of just local, when you think back to what the newspapers that were around, 40 years ago and still exist, how many more people they had covering, just City Hall as an entity. You had 2 people covering the city council, 5 people covering City Hall. Even at the City, we're not a huge newsroom, and we really try to do a very like reader focused guide, and then in addition to investigative pieces. But it is hard to vet every candidate, and I think a lot of people point to what happened with George Santos, with a little bit of New York City in his district. I know a lot of the political consultants working for his opponent, who he defeated, strictly blamed local news. And as I reminded them, how many people work for your firm? Why don't you give some of your money to local news so they can actually do this? So I think it is a problem. But there's also, I speak to young people that visit schools. I ask kids, it's TikTok, it's social media. I think also there's a real media literacy issue where people don't see the difference between opinion and news. People want to read, they don't want to read a even unbiased news story. They want to read, this person sucks and I hate them. And if you don't write a story that way, we've seen it with some of our coverage of Cuomo. We mention in every story why he left office and the investigation into him. But I think for some people who are incredibly anti-Cuomo, it's not enough. So it is complicated. But I do see a question here about your survey, Grace, or the Institute survey, about, they need more information about candidates and ballot measures. So I am curious from the panel, how do you get that to them? I guess my guess would be to meet people where they are, like a lot direct voter outreach, like what Christina was doing, and a lot of the other panelists, because if they're not reading the newspaper, they're not watching the 5 o'clock or the 6 o'clock news. That might be my answer, but I don't know if anyone else have. And then Jerry and Lena have questions. I guess especially for something as wonky as the ballot measures, and we have 2 charter revisions going on right now simultaneously, and what could end up on the ballot. I guess maybe it is voter, just direct outreach. I mean, that seems to be, we try to get as many people to sign up for our newsletters, and it's difficult to get, not to get all this information out in a concise and a coherent way. I see Jerry's question: do campaign finance board rules affect how opposing candidates can operate? That is an interesting question in terms of what you can spend money on, and I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in.
I said not operate, I meant cooperate. One candidate helping another one. I might have made it.
No, I think I read it wrong. No, I think that's a great question. I don't know if anyone else, especially people who've worked on campaigns, Chris, want to chime in on if there's.
I just think when you're going down the stretch with 7 days or 10 days or 12 days to go, you're not. I did have someone who came and said, "Hey, are you sure that this cross endorsement? Like, are you sure that you're allowed to do this?" And like print, like we had to print palm cards with Catherine Garcia, where the palm cards said Yang and Garcia on them, and we were handing them out in Chinatown and Prospect Park, Park Slope. And there was a question about like how we're going to pay for them, and who, like, we can't pay alone, we have to split it because they're both, our names are on it. It was like, but I think we actually spent some time thinking that through. I assume some other campaigns would probably just fake it till you make it with 8 days left, like some of the rules that lots of people think folks should take more seriously. I'm not sure how seriously folks take, although I think we actually did spend a lot of time, and I know the Garcia folks did too. I think what I thought Jerry's question is there's a cap in how much you can raise and spend in the race. And so, last year they raised it. In 21, they raised it because there was some idea that Ray McGuire, if the CFP thinks that someone's going to spend twice as much of their own money, they can slightly raise the cap or more than that. And they raised it last time to like 10 million, I think. And I think Yang and Adams, and to a slightly lesser extent, Scott, had that $10 million to spend. But the challenge is, like, you can't really spend that on going negative. You have to spend it on yourself because you have to get your message out there. And New York City television, which is still where most people are, if you want to hit lots and lots of people, you do it through streaming and through TV and through radio, and you can do digital. Obviously, we spent a ton on digital, way more than anyone else did. But if you're really looking to blanket, it's like $1 million a week of television. So it's hard to have like 6 different messages, right? It's hard to say like, vote for me, but then also like, this person is terrible. And so what you saw is you just didn't see a lot of people going negative with their campaign money. Sometimes they had independent expenditures that helped go negative a little bit, but I don't know that you'll see. I think there's an open question about whether Brad and Zoran and whoever are going to spend money to go after Andrew Cuomo or Eric Adams if he's in the race.
Karen, we have a question in the chat for you, specifically about civic engagement, beyond just an election year. But what kind of that accountability could look like with restrictions on nonprofits, and I know they can't endorse and that kind of thing, but I don't know if you want to chime in on how that engagement work can translate to their elected officials.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lena, for that question. I think we should be having ongoing conversations year round, as I mentioned. And for nonprofits, I'm a member of the League of Women Voters, New York City. We do tend to have those conversations year round. And we are not able to endorse candidates. So we can direct New Yorkers to sites and other places where they can get specific information about candidates. But overall, you can speak about the issues. You can speak about why it's important to vote. You can make the connection between voting and everyday issues. We can point them to ways that New Yorkers can get engaged in their communities, whether it's a community board. So there are a number of other things we can do. I hope that answers your question, Lena.
Thank you so much, Karen. I'm curious, like, what does that look like with elected officials? Like, what are you translating to them about what your community does with voting?
Would you say that? Would you repeat it, please?
Sorry. How do you translate to the elected official? Here's what our community members do when it comes to voting. Like, how do we do it on the other side so that when it's January and we're talking to our assembly members, we can also say, hey, did you know, we know it's not an election right now, but we're doing a lot of voting work. Do you ever do that kind of other side of the conversation?
Not exactly. But what we would want to do is have New Yorkers have community people in places where they can directly interact with those electeds. So if you get engaged in your community board, for instance, and the elected visits, then you're able to raise your hand and ask your questions directly, look them in the eye, assess them. And candidates, I don't think candidates pass through necessarily, but there are other spaces where candidates do pass through. And so part of the issue that we're having is that people are not civically engaged. So they're only hearing from folks once a year around election time, and that's just not enough.
Thank you so much. And this, I believe, will be your final question. Is looking at the time. It's from Syed. It's about whether ranked choice voting actually hinders a candidate's ability to gain momentum, especially because we say it's so hard to get their name out there and name recognition and getting on the ballot and then getting people to vote for them. Does anyone just briefly want to chime in on whether, when you're going door knocking and telling them vote for me, number 1 through 5, preferably 1 or 2. I don't know if that kind of kills those vibes and that momentum.
I think it lets them stay in the race. I mean, that's the, I think you had all these candidates, I sort of alluded to this at the beginning, you had all these candidates who were able to sort of convince reporters and donors and whoever else, like, no, there's ranked choice. So the fact that I have at 1% with 2 weeks left, you never know. And I think they're able to say to donors and the like that, like, they still have a chance. I don't know that it kills their momentum. And then you look at Garcia, for instance. I think she was able to say, hey, I don't know that I will have the most first place votes, but I expect to be on 51% of people's ballots. And that almost happened. And so arguably it gave her some momentum. And by the way, you saw Eric Adams fighting against that in 21 because he was worried about the opposite problem, that she would get to 51%.
Yeah, I was going to mention Catherine Garcia as the example of, she came out of nowhere with ranked choice voting. I mean, I remember a friend of mine, he was asking me in February who were the candidates. I didn't even list her as one of the candidates. I didn't even consider her as having any chance at all. Now that's because of the New York Times.
Times helped.
So we've been focused, we spent a lot of time speaking about the mayoral races, both in 2021 and this year. But ranked choice voting really helped at the city council level in 2021. We did end up with a very representative or a more representative city council than ever before. And to Syed's question about the door knocking, whether it's changing messaging, I'm not sure that it does. When you're door knocking, you're as a candidate, you're basically communicating what your issues are, why you're running, and why the voter should vote for you, should rank you number 1. Now, if the voter at that point says, well, I'm going to choose Syed as my number 1 because he will maybe freeze rent. At that point, the candidate has an opportunity to say, oh, that is great. Do you know that my platform also includes housing affordability? Let me tell you some more. So I understand Syed is great and plans to freeze your rent for you, but here are the other things that I am going to do. And so I would like you to consider me. So I'm not sure that, I guess maybe it does change the messaging at the door, but in I think a positive way, a way that benefits the voter.
One thing ranked choice voting does in city council elections, it somewhat diminishes the problem of candidates being spoilers. 4 years ago, I was talking to a potential candidate who wanted to run in a district in Brooklyn that was about, in a primary, probably 60% African American and 30% white. And this was a white candidate who had run before. And if there was a 7-way race without ranked choice voting, he might have won. It was a white candidate representing this majority African American district. And I convinced him that, hey, you can't win. You may get 29% of the vote and against 7 candidates, that's great, but you're not going to go, you're never going to even break 40 when it ends up one-on-one with you against an African American candidate. So there's less fear of that. Oh, you got to drop out because I'm the stronger woman, or I'm the stronger Hispanic or stronger Asian. Presumably, you'll get those second or third choice votes later on.
Well, great. I know we are at time right now, but I don't know if Grace, you wanted to close out, or Neil, or yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Katie. Thank you to everyone. This was an amazing conversation, super engaging. Jerry, I love that you joined the panel. Great to see you. But really just a huge thank you to everyone on the Zoom, because you all are out there doing this work to boost voter engagement, educate New Yorkers about how to vote with ranked choice voting, the importance of this election and elections in general. It feels odd to briefly introduce Five Borough at the very tail end of this, but I realize we are an organization that some of you may not be familiar with because we were only founded in 2022. So we're still pretty young. We're a nonpartisan public policy think tank that develops and advances policy solutions to tackle major challenges facing the city. We care deeply about the future of New York, and anyone who cares about the future of our city cares about having a well-informed and engaged electorate, and that's why this work is so important. And we're grateful to be part of it with GoVoteNYC. And just one final plug on the People's Pulse. Was really excited to talk with you all about it today. The link to the poll results is in the chat. It's on our website. But really, that was created to be a public resource for community organizations, many of which are represented on this call, to help give you all a clear snapshot of where New Yorkers are at, what their top priorities and concerns are, and to use that data when you engage with candidates and folks who are running for office. So I know many of your organizations may be hosting candidate forums, may be talking with your membership about how to get engaged. So please use the People's Pulse as a resource to help guide those conversations and really help hold the folks who are running for office to account to make sure that they're talking about the issues that are really top of mind for New Yorkers. So thank you for all of your engagement and leadership. Thank you, Katie, for moderating, and thank you to all of our panelists and to Neil Coleman for partnering with Five Borough on this.
Thanks,
Take care.